Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergate. This day, March 1961, an Atlanta area woman by the name of Ruby Doris Smith Robinson is attending her first meetings of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, also known as SNCC, which we've discussed a few times on this show, I think. But Smith Robinson is, at that time, a student at Spelman College, the HBCU in Atlanta, and has been active for a few years in civil rights protests. And now she is starting to link up with SNCC, which would be an incredibly important organization throughout the South, particularly in these years through the first half of the 1960s, doing voter registration drives and more throughout Georgia and other states in the South. And Ruby Doris Smith Robinson would play a big part in SNCC. She would play a number of roles across their efforts, and then she would also, over the years, more and more, start to speak out about the gender and racial dynamics within the organization and across the civil rights movement as a whole. So we've been wanting to talk about the life and work of this really remarkable person for a while, but this is also a chance to talk about some of those dynamics around particularly gender within the movement. So here to do that, as always, are Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
Can I tell you the first thing that always strikes me when I see these stories? Just how young everyone is. Right?
They're babies.
I mean, babies, right? And I mean, you know, it's
we
incredible.
did nothing with our lives. We did nothing. We wasted away all of our youth.
So, you know, just to revisit some of those dates, you know, it's March 1961 is this moment when Ruby Doris Smith Robinson, I think she's a sophomore at Spelman at this point, but she's visiting SNCC, having already had a legacy of protest and already having been involved in the movement for a while since she was like 14, 15, 16 years old. And that's, I think, the interesting thing here, because she's, you know, carrying this legacy and this work that she's already done into a new organization that is then going to push things forward. It's kind of remarkable.
It's also remarkable that, like, when it comes to SNCC, she had done all of this activism before, and she wasn't actually sure she wanted to join SNCC because she was like, it seems like all they do is like planning meetings, and
I don't do enough,
right? Like, let's get our bodies out there.
Yeah, I mean, that's what's so wild about this story is that she doesn't necessarily think they're as hands-on as she wants them to be. She finally joins and decides to become a part of, you know, one of the first missions that she's a part of is to talk about jail versus bail issue. And she gets arrested. And not only is she arrested, but she's sentenced to 30 days in jail, like, as your first. Can you imagine that? Being like 19, 20 years old, and you finally decide you're going to join an organization, and then as a result, you get sentenced to 30 days in jail? Like, that's wild to me.
SNCC was like, is this real enough for you?
Yeah, I know, right? I know, right?
And I suppose this is a chance to talk a little bit about what SNCC was, you know, and this coalition, I would say, of kind of often white Northerners, often coming to the South. I think voter registration was often the main charge among it. And, you know, but it had this sort of like policy bent to it. And you can see where then Ruby Smith Robinson would be feeling like, well, I've been out in the streets. I've been doing sit-ins. I've been like feeling the brunt of this issue, you know, at a street level. And so the sort of let's sit around and have planning meetings thing isn't exactly where I'm at this moment.
Yeah, I mean, SNCC as an interracial organization is actually an important part of its mission, right? So many of the early parts of activism that Smith Robinson is involved in are things, as you were saying, Jody, like sit-ins. And many of those sit-ins were done by integrated groups because they were attempting to demonstrate this message of integration. And that becomes an important component of SNCC, that they're modeling the world that they're hoping to build.
I mean, you've seen those iconic images of like the Woolworths lunch counter on February 1st, and just how the kind of courage you had to sit at that lunch counter and have people harass you and taunt you and throw food on you or spit on you. Those pictures are still gripping to this day. And to think of those people who are engaged in that activism being teenagers or, you know, in the first few years of college makes it all the more gripping.
One other just tidbit here is this moment where, well, I guess it's March, so she's still in school, but like, it's important to remember because they're all so young. This is what you would do in your summers, and I'll talk about this a little bit more in a minute. But my mom spent a couple summers working with SNCC in the South, and a couple years after this. But there was a freedom summer because that's when like the kids were off school, and a lot of the northern kids were off school. But also here, she's in Spelman. Where is she finding time? And a lot of her it seems like a lot of her path towards being more involved with SNCC is literally when like all the groups that she's involved with at Spelman. School ends, I still want to be in the fight, where's the next meeting, and it's with SNCC, and that's how she sort of finds her way in.
That circulation between the campus and the movement is really important, not only because it means that she is getting more involved in the broader Atlanta freedom movement, but those white kids coming from the North and the West will go spend their summers in the South, and then they'll go back to places like Berkeley, and they will bring with them this commitment to civil rights activism. And this leads to a lot of the campus protests that you'll see not just in the South, but across the country.
Yeah.
And of course that flowed into the, Vietnam era as well.
I was just going to say that, it becomes a snowball for a lot of different protests that are all really interrelated.
Can I ask you a question about a little bit of her biography? And maybe I'm reading too much into this, but she is from Atlanta. She's born in 1942. She grows up in, like, I would say, an upwardly mobile Black community within Atlanta, and her parents are, her dad is a Baptist minister, her mother is a beautician, she goes to college, and so I wonder if like Ruby's class plays into this at all. And so I don't know what you make of that.
I think in some ways, I don't want to use the word privilege because that's fraud, but like the idea that her parents are professionals and that they are not dependent upon white businesses for their profession. So everything that they're doing is pretty much in the Black community. There's a lot of protection in that, but also prosperity as well when you are not having to be dependent upon, being a domestic worker or a migrant labor or something that's more labor intensive. The fact that she's going to college is still huge. Like, I mean, she has a lot more economic mobility than most Black people in the South do. The fact that she can, is of a big family and she's still going to college. Most big families were big families because they needed children to work on the farm, or they needed children to help pick cotton during the summertime. She's not far removed from that space at all. But I also think she kind of falls into the same space as like, the bougie Black Atlanta where you have like Kings coming out of that moment too. Angela Davis is coming out of that moment in which you do have pockets of very successful Black communities that are thriving, but are still committed to the cause of, integration and social justice.
And I wonder, too, if that experience of growing up in a kind of independent Black community not only gives her family a kind of economic stability, but actually feeds into some of her later criticisms around SNCC, around colorism, and around the disparities, not just between the Black and white activists, but among the Black activists.
You're used to hearing my voice on the world, bringing you interviews from around the globe.
And you hear me reporting environment and climate news. I'm Carolyn Beeler.
And I'm Marco Werman. We're now with you hosting The World Together. More global journalism with a fresh new sound.
Listen to The World on your local public radio station and wherever you find your podcasts.
What do we want to talk a little bit about that? I mean, she, comes in, she gets pretty active, and then given a fair amount of responsibility. Well, actually, let's talk a little bit about that because we've mentioned this a few times on shows. But the kind of work that women were assigned within movements versus the ones that men were. You have thoughts on that?
So many thoughts. This is what gets me so mad because you see this in SNCC, you see this in the CLC, you see it in CORE and the Black Panther Party. All of these freedom struggle groups have a real sexist problem. They just do. And the marginalization of women is so rampant that it's very difficult for women not to participate. Their participation is clear, but to get them out in the front, to allow them to have the microphone, to allow them to really be seen and prominent, is hard. Oftentimes, women were relegated to, hey, go get my coffee, and hey, go run this errand, and not given the same level of responsibility and respect that men were given.
And it's one of the reasons that you see the nascent second wave feminist movement coming out of these groups. I mean, there's Casey Hayden and Mary King write this piece called Sex and Caste, a kind of memo, where they're talking about how the members of SDS, Students for a Democratic Society, they were all about liberation and breaking down the walls of oppression. And then they were like, oh, you're a girl, you can go get the coffee. Or, oh, you're a girl, I'll have sex with you, and then I'll go, out and save the world. And so that it was recreating the old hierarchies in a movement that was supposed to be anti-hierarchical was a real awakening moment for a lot of activists.
I mean, one of the most famous lines, Stokely Carmichael, when he said the most prominent position of a woman in SNCC is prone. Like basically they're just here for sex. I mean, and even when you backtrack the damage is done, you know what I mean? So in terms of getting people to have a different level of visibility for women and women in leadership was a hard fought battle, and still is to this day, I think, a hard fought battle to get those voices, some volume.
It's a sign of how radical these liberation critiques were, that if you apply them to one part of society, that language and that message then spills over into all of these other hierarchies in ways that are, I think, unpredictable.
Yeah. And that's what Spelman did for her. I think when you go to an all-girls school and they tell you, you're getting your education and you are a leader, I think maybe she would have had a different political outlook had she been at another school.
Yeah, that's true. And Stokely Carmichael, I mean, you mentioned that quote. He also said of Robinson, he said, she was convinced that there was nothing that she could do. She was a tower of strength. And clearly she had within her a sense of I can just do whatever I want and I'm going to speak up when I see something that's wrong. I mentioned that my mom had spent a couple summers in Mississippi as part of the Freedom Summer stuff, and this was in '64. I called her up this morning to see if she kind of recognized this name or knew anything about this, and she didn't. She said, if you were in a small town or a certain part of a state, you probably didn't interact with much of the bigger leadership. But she certainly talked about how the kind of work that women were given, white women and black women within the movement, was very gendered. And so oh, you're a woman at best, you're going to be teaching, right? But you're not going to be out there doing the voter registration. You're certainly not going to be the voice of this movement in any way, and who's standing in front of the cameras, who's being quoted in papers, who's, it was always the men who were pushed forward. But she also said that she felt like there was this both tacit, but also just sort of that if questions of sexism would come up, it was kind of like, we're dealing with racism here, right? And don't distract from the main thing, right? And the idea of intersectionality didn't, people, that language wasn't there, but it was sort of used as a cudgel of no, we're not going to deal with that right now. We can't deal with that. We have to focus on, the task at hand, which is racial segregation. And so, there was that dynamic going on as well.
Black women have always had to sort of check their gender at the door or put their blackness at the forefront. And so, I mean, it's listen, we can walk and chew gum at the same time. But I think that instead of conquering all of these battles at once, it's we're going to conquer this one first and then next one. And then your issues are a little further down the line. They had not just a hierarchical way of how they saw leadership, but a hierarchical way of how they understood oppression and who was being harmed the most. And again, it's a common, unfortunate theme in a lot of these movements that are happening in the 60s and 70s. But it's interesting now, though. I mean, I don't know. I fast forward to today, and I feel you look at Black Lives Matter, started by 3 Black women. You look at a lot of the movements that are taking place now, and it's the women that are the most vocal, I think.
I think that's so important, Kellie. I was actually just teaching about Black Lives Matter this morning, and it's 2 queer Black women and a woman who's an immigrant from Nigeria who had to deal for a while with undocumented status. And they create an organization that is purposefully anti-hierarchical in the way that like Occupy Wall Street was. And I think a lot of that is in reaction to this earlier history, that there is something about the exclusion of these earlier movements that this kind of post-Joshua generation in particular is eager not to replicate.
I mean, I think what I love about the show is how we recover voices that most people don't know. But there's a really good book for people who want to know more called Hands on the Freedom Plow, and it's the personal accounts of women in SNCC. And it's edited by about a half a dozen women who were all members of SNCC. But it's a really thick, fantastic collection of, what people experienced during their activism and how they worked to get a lot of change, but also the struggles that were in front of them that sometimes felt insurmountable.
And there is also a book called Soon We Will Not Cry, The Liberation of Ruby Doris Smith Robinson by Cynthia Fleming. And so, we should shout out that as a sort of full-fledged biography of her. But yeah, okay, well, this is really fascinating, and I'm sure we will return to SNCC and the Freedom Rides and lots more in the future. But for now, I say thank you to Nicole Hemmer, as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And thanks to you, Kellie Carter-Jackson.
My pleasure.
Thanks for listening. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Our producer is Brittany Brown. Our transcripts, which you can find on our website, are done by Kala Nakua. This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX, a network of independent, creator-owned, listener-supported podcasts. Audrey Mardovich, executive producer, Yuri Lasordo, director of operations. Thanks to all of you who support this show by being members of Radiotopia. Find transcripts, sign up for our newsletter, find us on social, suggest topics, all that and more at our website, thisdaypod.com. See you soon.
Radiotopia from